some of the guidelines that you have to follow. When you pick a replacement behavior, it has to be something that is in the person's repertoire. In other words, it has to be a skill the person already has. So you might ask the question, well, what can I do if the student doesn't have the skill? Then you have to teach the skill. In the Conroy article, the little boy did not have the skill of using pictures and exchanging them to get access to objects. That's why they had to include a procedure for teaching it. So they used modeling, they used prompting procedures to teach him that skill, then they reinforced it for happening. You also want to pick a behavior that's going to be supported by the natural environment. That means you want to select a replacement behavior that people will recognize and reinforce automatically. Using a picture to request to pick an object is something that the people in that child's environment could learn to do. So you want it to be something that people would recognize. So using a communication skill that would be easily recognized, or teaching the kid a coping skill, like if you're teaching the kid to take deep breaths and move to a different area, you want that to be something that people would allow that child to do. You also want to include backup procedures. What are you going to do if a problem behavior occurs and it's not something you can easily ignore? I always assume that the problems are going to continue because they are. No intervention is going to result in in problem behaviors just completely stopping, no matter how much people might want them to. So you know that those problems are going to happen. Plan for those occurrences. Come up with a way you're going to respond that's going to minimize the reinforcement the problem behavior gets, and is going to minimize the disruption to the learning environment. With both DRA and DRI, you increase the interval for reinforcement, or you increase the response requirement for reinforcement over time. So initially, you would reinforce the student every time he engages in an alternative behavior. With DRI, you might increase the student for being on task. Initially you might do it every 3 minutes, let's say. Then you might increase that to 5 minutes, to 8 minutes, to 10 minutes. Typically with DRI, you're going to be using intervals of time, just because you're usually talking about behaviors that you measure with duration, like on task or in seat. With DRA, you're usually using ratio kinds of reinforcements, like you're reinforcing the student for engaging in a behavior a certain number of times. So with communication skills, you always deliver what the student requested, but in the beginning you might also use verbal praise. The verbal praise is what you would sort of fade out over time. You don't stop letting the communication work. What you do with communications is you start teaching the student to tolerate delays. So in the beginning, you want to give the student immediate access to something. Over time, you start requiring the student to wait a little bit. Like, oh, you want the car. Okay, wait just a minute and I'll get it. Or if the student is requesting a break, then it's like, oh, okay, you want a break. Finish this one first. So you start introducing very small delays, and then over time you make those delays greater and greater. That teaches the student to tolerate delays when they happen in the real world, because they will. We don't always get what we're after every time we ask for it. At least in my world, I don't. So, what are the steps to implementing a DRA plan? Well, first of all, you decide on the session length and times. In other words, how long are you going to implement this intervention? For these kinds of interventions, I strongly suggest you pick a finite period of the day when you're going to implement them. Use it at that time until you get it developed, until you get all the bugs worked out. Only then extend it to other times in the day. So let's say we're going to do this intervention for a period of time in the morning. The next thing you have to decide is what is the recording and reporting system I'm going to use. And I need to measure two different behaviors. I need to measure the new behavior I'm going to teach, and I need to measure the problem behavior as well. Because it's possible that I haven't selected the right alternative behavior. Maybe my functional behavior assessment wasn't correct. and this behavior is happening for another reason. So I want to pick a way to measure the problem behavior as well. If I don't see a decrease in the problem behavior as well, then I need to teach something else. So go back to the Conroy article. They taught the functional communication skill using the pictures was the alternative behavior. They continued to measure the occurrence of tantrum behaviors so that they could see what kind of effect this communication skill would have on the tantrum behavior. Step 3, choose an alternative response that would benefit the student or that would serve the same function as the unwanted behavior. So in the case of the Conroy article, they picked requesting objects because that served the same function as a problem behavior. If you had a kid who was engaging in behavior to escape a demand, you might teach the student to ask for help or to ask for a break. So it's some behavior that's going to serve the same function, and you have to pick a form of the behavior the student can do. And if the student can't do it, you have to teach it. Step 4, record baseline data on both the alternative behavior and the unwanted behaviors. You've got to have some kind of baseline so that you've got something to compare your intervention data to. So it's impossible to really know if it's working unless you can compare it to the student's behavior before you implemented the intervention. 5, communicate rules to the student. You communicate the program to the student in a way the student can best understand. If I can sit down and have a conversation with the student and explain the components of the program, I do that. With a lot of kids, you're going to have to use something else. You can use pictures, like an if-then chart might help. If you do this and you have a picture, then you earn this. Some kids have to learn by experiencing the system. So the example that I went over in class of the young man that I was working with the DRL program, it's a different program, but I could not sit down and explain the rules of the program to him. I had to let him experience the program to learn it. So whenever possible, do things like visual cues or visual supports to help students understand. Step 6, determine the schedule of reinforcement. Gradually begin by reinforcing all occurrences of the alternative response. So in the beginning, you reinforce it every time it happens, and then you set up a schedule for thinning the schedule of reinforcement. If it's a communication skill that you're teaching the student, you may decide that the student actually gets what he or she asks most of the time, but maybe you're not going to praise the student as much, maybe praise every other time than every third time. And then you may start delaying access. That's another way that you fade reinforcement. Number 7, as the above criterion is met, slightly increase the amount of responding per reinforcement. Well, this simply means that you thin the schedule of reinforcement. You don't reinforce every time anymore, but you reinforce according to whatever your schedule is, every second time, every third time. And then you gradually keep thinning that out. And then 8, as the criterion is met at each reinforcement change, gradually increase the amount of responding. It's I think that's kind of redundant, isn't it? But you get the idea. You just keep changing the schedule of reinforcement, thinning it out. And the reason you do that is you want the student to continue using this behavior when you're not reinforcing it every time. So hopefully what happens is natural reinforcers take over. If you teach a student to use a communication skill, and that communication skill usually results in that student getting access to something, then the natural reinforcers will keep that behavior going. If that doesn't happen, then we've done something wrong. We haven't taught a functional skill to the student. Here's just an example I'd like you to go through with guided practice, and this is actually a little girl that I worked with. We were concerned about her because she was really cute and very tiny, and anytime someone walked into the school, she would just run up and give them a big hug, and she gave really good hugs, and she was really cute, so it was hard not to reinforce her. So what we wanted to teach her to do was to shake hands and introduce herself to other people just as an alternative behavior. I know it doesn't quite result in the same reinforcement as getting a hug, but it is a way for her to initiate an interaction with other people, and we thought it was more appropriate. So the target behavior was hugging visitors when they enter the room. The alternative behavior is shaking the person's hand. And then we had to come up with an operational definition, and this is the one we came up with. We decided when we were going to implement the intervention, and since visitors usually came into the school in the morning, we made the intervention in effect for 3 hours in the morning. Later on, we extended it to the rest of the day. We had to decide how we were going to count the problem behavior, or running up and hugging, and how we were going to count the appropriate behavior. Both of these are measured by frequency. But they're a little different because you can't run up and hug a person unless a person comes in. So really what we needed was a percentage score. How many opportunities did she have to go up and hug someone? And how many times did she hug the person versus shake their hand? We collected some baseline data. We did this for several days, but this is just an example of how we calculated it. She did know how to shake hands. She did do it sometimes, but just not most of the time. So about 70% of the time in baseline, she'd go up and hug the person, and about 30% of the time she would shake their hand. So we started out with continuous reinforcement. We did do some social skills instruction. We used modeling and role play to teach her to do the handshaking instead, and we reinforced her a lot for doing that. And the final goal is we wanted her to go up and shake someone's hand. Some other things we had to do is we had to work on teaching her to discriminate a stranger from somebody that she didn't know. And it was actually, I knew we'd made some progress because this gentleman walked in, and he was, a very friendly looking elderly gentleman, looked like everybody's grandfather. And he saw this little girl, and he said, well, hi, how are you? Good morning. And she pointed her finger at him and said, stranger, stranger. So I knew we'd taught her to recognize a stranger, but we had to teach her a more appropriate response. So, now let's talk about DRL, differential reinforcement of low rates. This is one of my favorite interventions because a lot of the problem behaviors that we deal with are things that are not hugely serious, but they're problems because they happen a lot. There are different ways we can do it. With DRL, it's differential reinforcement of low rates. So we're reinforcing a student for engaging in a behavior a certain number of times or fewer. There are different types of DRL. There's full session DRL, which is the kind that I use the most because I think it's the easiest to implement. And you're looking at how many times a behavior happens during a session, like a class period. Interval DRL deals with just looking at the rate of a behavior. Like you decide that if the behavior happens no more than 1 time per minute, then that's acceptable. This can be a very effective way to implement DRL, but I find that it's pretty hard to implement. You have to be very vigilant about looking at a clock, and it's just really hard to do. So that's why I usually go with the full session DRL. And spaced responding, is another way of looking at interval DRL. It's, looking at an inner response interval. In other words, you want at least a minute between talk outs or a minute between someone saying something. Again, it can be useful in some situations, but it can be kind of hard to implement. So I'm going to spend most of the time talking about full session DRO because I think it's the most practical one, and it's the one that I believe you'll use most of the time. At least that's what I found.